I would join.
Good morning. So it's wonderful to have this crowd here. Welcome on behalf of the Center for Poetry and Poetics to our symposium on poetry and race. Bringing together leading scholars and poets and poet scholars with a range of specializations. We're hoping to explore today questions concerning what we can learn from poetry about race and what we can learn from race about poetry. Yes, you're thinking poetry, of course, that would have to be part of what a poetry center would want to engage with, but why race? After all, as the philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah has recently and repeatedly said, genetics has shown that genes are not inherited in racial packages. So there are, strictly speaking, no races. Well, here in Charlottesville, we were reminded just over a year ago, of course, by torch-wielding, hate-spewing racists that it's not enough to declare that race is over. The complexities and contradictions of racial thinking are, of course, written into our institution's DNA. The founder, both a race-theorizing slaveholder, and his writings and inspiration to anti-colonial, anti-racist leaders of liberation struggles from India and Vietnam to the American South. How can poetry help us think through these complicated issues in their national and transnational dimensions? Well, I believe our distinguished guests, representing a range of specializations, can indeed help us. After all, they've written about topics as wide-ranging as poetry and Pan-Africanism with a small p, and a poem about a duly ignored monument to Cecil Rhodes, dead as diamonds, Tsitsi, Jaji. About the cross-racial connections of African, Caribbean, and Irish poets through print media and public institutions, Nathan Seitzman. About the struggle of Asian American writers to repurpose the Orientalist legacy of the Euro-modernists, Josephine Park. About translingual Latinx poets, such as himself, wrestling with diasporic legacies from the unincorporated territory of Puerto Rico, where people, as he says, are both U.S. citizens and colonial subjects. Noel. About indigenous and Caribbean peoples and poets, dealing with the vexed but central issues of language, rights, history, and land, J. Edward Chamberlain. And about a black aesthetics capacious enough to allow for innovations such as her own refractions of African American experience through the ghazal, pantun, the ekphrastic poem, even Shockley. Then there's Lorna Goodison, about whom I'll say more later today, but she of course grapples with power and nuance with the race-based thinking that undergirded the colonial enslavement and suffering of peoples on her Caribbean island. But as Auden says, let our thinks first all be thanks. I'd like to thank our speakers who traveled to be with us here today, in some cases on very long journeys, and in almost all cases delayed journeys, and across different time zones. We have brochures that are available. I don't know if anyone needs one, let us know. We'd be happy to give you one. They have the glittering biographies and full schedule for the day. So I've asked our panel chairs to please keep their introductions brief to allow abundant time for what I hope will be a spirited exchange after our presentations. I'd also like to thank you, my colleagues, students, community members who are here on the eve of fall break, and encourage you to contribute actively to the day during our open discussions. We really want to think of this as an opportunity for exchange across a variety of areas. And I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, Creative Writing Program and the Institute of the Humanities and Global Cultures, which graciously granted us the use of this space today. And to Peter Miller, who did a huge amount of work behind the scenes to make this day happen. So our first panel today is chaired by Joanne Gavin, Executive Director of the acclaimed Furious Flower Poetry Center at James Madison University. As an accomplished scholar and longtime convener of conferences on Black poetry, she's a visionary leader in poetry and race studies, and I'm delighted to say that, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to thank her for accepting the invitation to collaborate and bring her invaluable experience to our gathering today. Thank you.
I love the introduction, and you apparently know how to select a room for a talk like this. It's a great crowd, and it's wonderful to be here to see old friends whom I haven't seen since 2014. Yeah. And I just wish you the best for this center, because they're needed. They're needed all over the country, all over the world. I'm going to make this short because I want more time for our speakers. So I'm going to introduce just very briefly our three panelists. Tsitsi Jaji is an associate professor of English and African American Studies at Duke University. She is the author of Africa in Stereo, Music, Modernism, and Pan-African Solidarity, a poetry collection, Beating the Graves, and a chapbook. Today, her panel discussion will be, Where is Africa? Nathan Seitzman is assistant professor of English and a core faculty member of the Institute of African Studies at Emory University. He is the author of Poetry, Print, and the Making of Post-Colonial Literature. He served as a co-convener of the 2016 African Literature Association Conference that was held in Atlanta. Today he will talk with us about the vision of Africa turning left, reading contemporary African poetry. And Josephine Park is a professor of English and Asian American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of Apparitions of Asia, Modernist Form, and Asian American Poetics. Her presentation today explores the poetics of war and incarceration. And today she will talk about the poetics of consolation. I believe that we are all in for an exciting journey as we cross racial, political borders, explore intersections of post-colonial African literary tropes, and map the lyric soul of Asian American poetry. Because of the clarity and courage of their scholarly explorations, they are opening a space for transnational discourse on poetry and race. If you allow me just one signature exercise. I usually, when I'm introducing poets, I usually write them a little poem. But because I was admonished to keep this short, I have written a haiku. So, and I think this will come up in the discussion in some form. Haiku for the panel. Take us where Asian and African muses play, hokum and kora. generous than the one who was snapping back there. And I want us to keep in mind this wonderful quote from a yet unpublished piece that will be in our latest anthology that will be coming out in April of 2019 from Tyemba Jess. He says in one part of his Poetics essay, "We'll never know all the poems that never got written, that held the sound of lovers' names, of secret joys and pains, of furious, foiled plots for escape. And while we have the collective songs of praise and struggle that soared out of the mouths of ancestors, deemed legal chattel, we're still forging backward into history to build monuments of words that have a prayer of approximating their stories. I know we will hear such stories today. Would you please greet our first panelist, Tsitsi Jaji."
Good morning, everyone. I want to begin by thanking Jahan, Peter, who has been just phenomenal in helping me figure out how to do this with a 3-month son down the hall. I apologize. Screams and interventions that happened here. Thank you, John, for the very kind introduction. Let me turn on my timer. Also, thank you to Sylvia Chong, if she's here. She gave us her office so that he has a space to be. My title today, which actually is still "Where is African Poetry?" Is a question that I find myself genuinely stymied by. And I've taken the invitation to think through that question as a poet as much as a scholar quite seriously, even given the company here. My basic argument today is that language and race are two sides of the same coin where African poetry is concerned. Social identities are more sharply divided along ethnic lines than skin tones in many spaces, and most ethnic groups name themselves as speakers of a specific language. In what follows, I consider where African poetry is written, published, and read by attending to the languages it speaks in. A little bit of autobiographical stuff. My first book of poems came out from the African Poetry Book Fund, and my second will be published through Cave Kano. While both presses are devoted to poets of African heritage, they also hail different communities of writers and readers, those of the African continent and those of the Black US, respectively. And my location and relation to race is complex. I was raised in Zimbabwe, born when it was Rhodesia, a segregated society divided between Europeans and Africans. My mother is a white, but not quite European, American, and my father a Black Shona-speaking Zimbabwean. I, of course, arrived as an inconvenient race puzzle for the state, the essential truth being that I was not white. And today, I identify politically as a Black woman and carry a US passport. Poetry allows me to work most forthrightly through the messiness of race as locally contingent, gendered, and inherited. Its deranged and rearrangeable grammars allow me to pick at the scab of language loss. And I'd like to open with the first poem from Other Times, the collection that's coming out. It narrates precisely the scene in my childhood when I slipped out of Shona and into English, which sets up the issues I'd like to discuss today. Mother tongue. Mother of two, mixed and matched Ohio blonde, brings her brown babies, born to a brand new nation, home alone. Cash-strapped, father of two is left behind, husbanding their shared hearth. She tames the airbound toddler boy on an elastic leash. In the airport, an unknown wasp-waist girly woman squawks in alarm, her blessedly untested parental principles. When boy won't budge, his corduroy seat sails across the waxed floors while sister does dragging duty, a trail of gleam in their wake. That sister's bush-born vernacular follows this proven logic. With mother, speak mommy's talk. Otherwise, be at home in words. Fatherless for a spell, her tale of ups and downs and pressure and vomit in a paper bag wells up at the sight of the first matching man. Black is beautiful, powered by pride, wounded with each step, blunted by each frisk. Black is the color of our first true love, Baba, warm heart beating to calm colic, nightmares, and memories flicker of something history will call Chimurengo. The language of home spills off daughter's tongue, drowning this strange umber man whose skin is a flag of peace. His face laughs, bewilders, then unsettles his dread. White woman, panic, will bring only trouble. He harbors no desire for the body of this bronze girl child. No bride, no candy, no white van out back. Suddenly he sees they look like family, yet he can cite no ocean to wash them apart. Mother knows best. So sorry. Mother knows best. She clasps small brown hand in hand and smooths golden head of spiral hair with free hand. She spells out a new code. Everyone here speaks only mother's tongue. Now, sister does too. End of story. Now, how is this an African poem? It would not be coming out through Kavikanam if the African Poetry Book Fund had not done my first book. Working with the APBF has connected me to other African writers through group readings, writing introductions, adjudicating a prize, and co-editing an anthology. I'm very committed to raising African poetry's profile, but doing so from the privileged perch of a U.S. academic appointment. I am aware that my location influences and distorts which readers and writers hold sway over defining the contours of contemporary African poetry. This dilemma played out on social media when the Brunel University African Poetry Prize announced its 2018 shortlist. This is a new prize and the richest prize for poetry, and it's based in the in the UK. And only 2 of the 8 shortlisted writers lived on the continent, and also the 3 final awardees resided in the US or the UK. One critic, Alexander Ubani, interpreted this as a fault line between blacks who by implication were raised by virtue of their living in the diaspora and Africans who lived on the continent. He was reacting to the founder, Bernardine Evaristo's perhaps inelegant statement, which justified the judge's decision by calling for more creative writing workshops on the continent. Their argument was over where the divergent values and aesthetics of poetry's languages should be determined. Where is African poetry? This is not a new dilemma. We could argue that African poetry has always been concerned with diasporas and itineraries. One of African poetry's foundational texts is the centuries-old epic of Sundiata, an unlikely founding figure of the Mande Empire, whose wanderings as a crippled and ostracized young man are central to his ascension to power. And when one sets aside the Anglophone-centric approach that this paper is guilty of, we recall the much storied genesis of Francophone poetry in Negritude and the student travels of Senghor, Ravi Manjara, Diop, and others in France, and the long-standing role of the journal and editorial house Présence Africaine in enabling global Black poetic connections through regular publication of original and translated poems should also not be underestimated. But returning to race, as I mentioned before, in most former settler colonies and some northern African nations, anti-Black racism may operate similarly to in the US, but in many parts of the continent, race is seen as a global northern construction. Nonetheless, the consequences of racialized violence and empire make race both a silent and a priori factor in all linguistic expression. One only writes in a European language if, at some point, one's people were colonized. And as I've mentioned already, for much of Africa, it's phenotypical difference that is seldom as relevant as its analog, ethnicity, which is a cluster of ideas and values linked to hereditary group identities, anchored then in family, clan, totem, and historical political organizing structure. Whether on the continent or in the diaspora, language locates the writer in both history and the contemporary, in familial and civic collectivities. But poetry is a unique form of writing because it does not demand that one choose a single language. It enables one to shuttle between languages and thus entertains alternatives to race's exclusivity. Indeed, poetry's economy allows some writers to include translations with their African language works, contradicting a familiar argument against such writing on the basis of small readerships. And because European languages remain dominant modes of instruction, these are often auto-translations, works of poetry in and of themselves. Badilisha Poetry Exchange, which is this slide here, is an important venue for such work. And indeed, there's more and more publishing on digital media, which makes the wear of African poetry nearly moot, at least for readers. With poems in almost a dozen African languages, not to mention English, Portuguese, French, and German, linguistic heritage and histories are hyperlinked. Most poems not in English are published with translations, which again reinscribes a particular hierarchy, but also a commitment to simultaneity. Memory Chirere, a faculty member at the University of Zimbabwe, is featured on the site. His poem, Pamarano, exploits the valences of Shona, a language spoken by over 8 million people, to ask a question especially poignant, given that resident Zimbabweans and those in the diaspora live vastly different lives. What does writerly success abroad mean when one has no audience at home? How ironic this question becomes when posed in Shona. But Chirere's translation illustrates the way that race registers differently in an African versus European language. His bilingualism comes by virtue of Zimbabwe's settler colonial history, though through auto-translation he distinguishes between two fundamental understandings of belonging, one familial and one civic. Pamarano, and I've just given an extract here. Kanandave gamba revatorwa asindiri chitopota kuama zambu jinoreve. When I become a hero amongst foreigners and a scoundrel among my people, is that worth the while? The translation of Hama, which means family relatives, as my people, a more national designation, illustrates that distinction that I'm trying to draw between race as an ethnic hereditary linguistic category in African imaginaries versus race as a political anonymizing category in global northern imaginaries. And I know anonymizing is awkward and we could come back to it and should. Other recent publications engage these questions. In 2015, Jalada, another electronic journal, edited by a collective based in Kenya, devoted an issue to language. Approaches varied. For example, there were poems that thematized, say, the languages spoken by Fulani women as water and song, not words. In several other cases, however, a single poem could be displayed in side-by-side translations, and collaborations across a range of spoken, informal, and elite speech became immediately visible and audible in many cases. Audio files were posted as well. Kenyan author Mwali Sitwawa's poem, The Changes, for example, appears alongside translations into Sheng and Kiswahili by Lydia Akwabi. Now, Akwabi's comfort in both the urban Creole of Sheng and the official, yet also regionally specific lingua franca of Kiswahili affirms both national and transnational Pan-African literary correspondence. For Africans who live outside the continent, language poses a challenge to one's legitimacy as a poet and word worker. In many parts of the continent, the preferred term for one's first language is mother tongue, and thus the familial, hereditary, and by extension, racial lineages lace choices about language. Again, this is not new. Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing Language taught us to ask this question quite a while ago. And in a poem that I've written for the Festschrift for his 80th birthday that will be coming soon, I play on the title of his novel, Grain of Wheat. Grain scatterer, we too have shed our apostolic alias and followed you into the shade to hear our voices bloom. Here Rapopo, here Chibage, here Rio, here Nzungu, here Nanga, here sweet, sweet Nope. Here a name we call ourselves. You have left us no choice, our stubborn prophet of Kikuyu, but to try our tongue and listen as silence softly breaks. In the closing lines, I'm of course echoing the title of M. Norbesi Phillips' early collection, She Tries Her Tongue, Her Silence Softly Breaks. And this is no accident. The Caribbean has a library of poetry and a reservoir of distinctive creoles speaks to me as a way to articulate the simultaneity of racial feeling, eliding splits between global north and south. In another poem, To Bless the Memory of Tamir Rice, which of course commemorates the 12-year-old shot by police in Cleveland, I switched to my attempt at Jamaican patois. And I think writing it, I was very conscious of the fact that this was borrowing a language that I wasn't asking permission of, perhaps. And I borrow it to recount a reunion of Gullah and Sierra Leonean branches of a family separated by slavery and war. Several poets in the African Poetry book series who live in the U.S. take up this theme as well, gravitating towards the possibility of movement between languages. In her award-winning collection, Fuchsia, the Ethiopian-American poet Matem Shifra writes, "If you ask how to say burgundy in Tigrinya, you will be told it's the color of sheep blood, without the musty smell of death attached to it. It's also the color of my hair dipped in fire, and the greasy texture of clotted arteries, and the folding skin of pineapple lilies, and the sagging insides of decaying roses, and the butterfly leaves of blooming perennials, and spongy strawberries drowning in wine." In transfusing Tigrinya's visceral color imagination into her English, Shifra declines to settle in exclusive binaries. Burgundy swings between lifeblood and clotted arteries, blooming and decaying, floating and drowning. Like a pendulum between English and Greek, also, Shifra plays on the scientific name for pineapple lilies. These flowers are native to southern Africa, and their scientific name, eucomis, means beautiful hair, say, dipped in fire. Poetry's scope for encoding multiple meanings through diction, etymology, and imagery enables Shifra to elide the U.S.'s racializations, which tend to be high contrast, black and white. Another Silliman Prize winner, Safia El Hilo, lays claim to the Sudan, DC, and New York as homes. Several poems in her collection, The January Children, explore the stage of multilingualism, where languages mix in memory. Writing in both Romanic and Arabic script, the poem's page displays an ambivalence, more often simply narrated. When she names the Atlantic as that site where languages garble, the middle passage, with its severance of linguistic as well as familial ties, cannot help but resonate with an American audience. And I would say a global audience, of course, but it has a special poignancy here. At the same time, her publication on sites like South Africa's Words and Sounds, which has a Pan-Africanist orientation, anchors her solidly in a continental context. My approach to language in this talk has presented race as an hereditary principle, but this risks inscribing heteronormativity as a defining African value. Yet there are many pre-colonial figures who highlight the long histories of sexual diversity on the continent. For example, my totem's founding figure, Banyemba, is remembered for her or their intersex body. By honoring them in Shona and in English in the Banyemba sequence, I adapt a traditional Shona praise poetry genre of my totem, the zebra, searching for diction that simultaneously celebrates their masculinity and femininity. I also want to wrestle with the ways too many of my own poems about family seize up along gender lines. Writing to Banyemba in my own Letembo makes space for their unsettled, non-binary queerness. In the face of post-independence government's adoption of English anti-buggery laws to advocate homophobia as an African custom, what language speaks to my pre-colonial ancestors' reality? And is English up to the task? In the penultimate poem, I ask, wouldst thou have recognized our stories, bullets in the wallet of your womb? Wouldst thou, our splendid sister, have been happier hunting as a brother? Our blessed third gender ancestor, how shall we summon you? And while many of the poems in the sequence praise Banyemba's lived reality as a sister and foremother, the closing poem in the sequence more fully embraces Banyemba's masculinity, giving their non-binary self space for a queerness reaching for the glitter of drag in the totemic stripes of the zebra, a creature whose alternating patterns outwit the rigid boundaries of race. Oh, Daddy Rex, you hornbill bronze, shake that mane, baby. Flash that strobe-colored coat. Dazzle us, old guinea eyes, all black and white and red all over. Thank you.